opening statements, I'll engage with the discussants on points that they raised, try to get them to clarify their positions. And then about after an hour of that, we'll open it up for your questions. And as you've been informed, you can post those questions in the chat function here on Teams. And we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes to go over those questions. So my role, as I see it, is to keep the discussion moving and ensure that each speaker is given an opportunity to clarify their thoughts. But before I introduce our speakers, I'd also like to give you my observations on this issue of the rise of populism, increasing polarization, and shared narrative. So my understanding is that a shared narrative is really fundamental to the success of any organization, be it a company, a religion, or a country. In his best-selling book, Sapiens, and I have a slide here for that, Yuval Harari argues that myths and fictions, which I think is just another way to describe narratives, accustom people, as he says, nearly from the moment of birth, to think in certain ways, to behave in accordance with certain standards, to want certain things, and to observe certain rules. They thereby create artificial instincts that enable millions of strangers to cooperate effectively. So in this book, Harari argues that it is only with shared narratives that we can form such large societies as we have, and have concepts such as nation states. He says that this is not a natural condition. And I think a lot of us have seen research that suggests that we really can only have relationships with up to 150 people. That's about our capacity for those kinds of cooperations. So anything beyond that gets unmanageable. Yet we live in cities and countries with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And it seems for the most part, I think we get along fairly well. So I think we do have a shared narrative in Canada. I think we can agree on the rule of law. I think we have agreement on the process of free and fair elections. There seems to be overwhelmingly a belief in some form of capitalism and free markets or free trade. But we also have to remember, that for the most part, Canadians do cooperate effectively. We go to school, we get jobs, we pay our taxes, and we obey, for the most part, again, we obey the laws of the land. So I think this is a shared narrative of Canada, but that doesn't mean that we agree on all aspects of the narrative. So populism, when we sort of bring that into the discussion, I think it's a way to capture the discontent for people who feel that their role in this narrative has been diminished or ignored. If we think about even the Brexit populism, I think that's where people really start thinking about the threat of populism that led to the Leave vote. I think that highlighted the problem for many Britons, that while free trade, again, England had been engaged in free trade with the European Union for decades. So on the most part, there was a shared narrative that free trade was good. But what they found is that was good for the highly educated. It was good for the highly mobile, but it left tradespeople and labor markets behind. And so what ended happening is getting a really ugly debate over immigration. And we've seen that debate repeated both in the United States and to a lesser extent in Canada. So similarly, protest movements regarding Indigenous rights, climate activism, and more recently, the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrates the discontent with this so-called consensus on the shared narrative of Canada. So I suggest to you that populism and protest are two different manifestations of the same thing. Essentially, people challenging the status quo and arguing for a different myth or a different narrative. So just this past weekend, the Black Lives Matter movement in Toronto made the case to defund the police in their attempt to find solutions to Canada's criminal justice system. So although it's unlikely that any Canadian jurisdiction will acquiesce to that demand, it does provide an opportunity to start discussions on how criminal justice, the police, and the courts can respond to systemic racism. So while I applaud the desire to create and build a shared narrative for Confederation, I think we should be mindful that we don't ignore the legitimate concerns of those who want to challenge the dominant narrative. Oftentimes, in our desire to move government and policy towards positive ends, we tend to be uncomfortable with disagreement. Even the words populism and polarization have this sort of negative connotation. During elections, pundits and the media decry the negativity of campaigns. Yet I think that disagreement is one of the only ways we actually can move forward. It is actually when we disagree that we have dialogue and a mechanism for greater understanding. So in this book that I'm going to share with you, In Defense of Negativity, this is a study by John Geer, where he looks at negative advertising in presidential election campaigns from 1960 to 2004. And he asserts that the proliferating attack ads are far more likely than positive ads to focus on salient political issues rather than politicians' personal characteristics. So he argues that the ads enrich the democratic process. They provide voters with relevant and substantial information before they head to the polls. As he states, at one level, everyone understands that conflict is part and parcel of politics. But at another level, there is a desire to sweep such disagreements under the rug and talk instead about points of agreement. It may be more civil and even understandable to downplay the core disagreement we all have. The problem with this approach, however, is that we often fail to appreciate the important role negativity can play in democratic government. So I suggest to you that polarization is a natural consequence of negativity. The challenge in our modern digital world is to find a way to go beyond echo chambers and find a mechanism to openly discuss our differences. And this is to ensure all voices are heard. We may not be able to reconcile open debate from different perspectives and formulating a unifying narrative for Confederation, but I'm looking forward to hearing this discussion from our panelists on how these seemingly impossible tasks might be achieved. So, as Brad had said, our panelists are Mike College, President of Canadian Public Affairs Ipsos, and Don Lenahan, an expert on public engagement, accountability, and governance. So I'll remind our discussants that your opening statements will be about 4 to 5 minutes, and I'll have Mike start with the data on how big this problem is.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a definite position on polarization, but I do have a couple of issues that I want to bring up that I think are challenges in the process of building a narrative and moving forward on this. The first, I don't think you can talk about a polarized electorate without talking about what's happened with the news media, with social media. 81% of global citizens say Can you hear me okay? Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. So did you hear the 81% who were challenged by the news and information, can't understand if it's who to trust? News has become nearly instant, and everybody has the power to make news or write news. Right? If you go back to 2004, there was a Pew poll that came out that said that millennials were as likely to get their news from Jon Stewart as they were from NBC News, CBS News. And at the time, a lot of people said, but that's okay because he's fairly progressive and it's a good source of news, and it may be entertainment, but at least they're still getting it. That has turned considerably today when some 25 million people get their news from Donald Trump's Twitter feed. It's 55 million. He has followers, assuming some of those are fake, which dwarfs what the Twitter feeds of NBC, CBS. So that's all led to it. So you have to look at sort of how you communicate in this environment and the challenges that you get there and the trust factors. Don, in his opening piece, wrote a section on trust as a factor for government, which I do think is a factor, but I also think efficacy and alignment with the public are as big or bigger parts. In a global study we did where we asked people about sort of the efficacy of government and how it lined up, really the drivers of trust. They said that against 8 other sectors, whether it was the banking sector, the not-for-profit sector, retail sector. Government is less likely to be as good at what it does as they are, is less likely to be well led than those other sectors are, is less likely to share the core values as a global study than other people are, less likely to keep its promises, less likely to be open and transparent. So you see that government starts off with a very difficult conversation where people don't necessarily, I'll say, trust, but don't think it can actually achieve some of these goals, even if they did feel the trust. In terms of alignment, 7 in 10 Canadians say that the economy is rigged to favor the rich and powerful. About the same number, 6 in 10 say that traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like them. And that's not just in Canada, it's 50% in Sweden, 7 in 10 in the UK, and almost 80% in France. So you have this real feeling of disconnect, which makes it more of a challenge just for government to lead these kind of narratives. In terms of a polarized society, I'm personally much more worried about a splintering society in Canada. The US is definitely polarized along political lines, polarized along race. In Canada in 2016, we asked Canadians if they share the same outlook on life, share the same opinions, have the same values as other Canadians or others in their community. And it was only 47% of Canadians who said, I'm in this, I feel the same. By 2018, that had dropped to 37% of Canadians. Now, COVID has brought us together, and we're now at 53% of Canadians who say that I share the same values. So there's a bit of a rise as we've pushed back on the two enemies, the health enemy and the economic enemy that is COVID. But we've already seen since April that starting to recess a little bit. So Canadians have very quickly turned into a more splintered view of the world. And so I think that is more of a factor. And I see us developing polarization or splintering not only east-west, not only across regions, but big cities, small cities, pensions versus non-pensions, and along generations as well. And then just one final note, the context matters. We entered the 2018 very low on our economic and social resilience in our view of the world. And and we have yet to recover from that. Someone wants peanut butter cookies for breakfast. And I'll pass it over to Dawn. Thank you.
Just before Dawn starts, we had some technical problems there, so my timer had been working, but my audio hadn't, so I completely missed everything that you had said. So
did others hear what I said?
I don't know. It was brilliant.
It was brilliant. I don't know how what other people got. I got kicked out for a while, so help me out here if people wanted to repeat everything.
Do you want a 1-minute summary?
Yes, I would helpfully, so that way I can get a question out to you. Okay.
I don't think you can look at this issue without looking at sort of the changes in news media. There's more of it than ever before, and it is self-created. It's peer-created. There's some of those people who are leading the popular or polarized view actually have millions of followers, and that's different than we were even a decade ago. Trust is a factor, but governments don't align. I'll skip the numbers, don't align very well on efficacy or alignment. So people doubt their ability to actually get things done, particularly big things. It's been ongoing in Canada for years, sort of angst around healthcare, and people sort of throw up their hands and say it's never going to change because governments can't figure out how to fix it. We started to add to that list. The other issue is alignment. In Canada, it's 6 in 10 who say traditional parties and politicians don't care about me. And we have lots of data that say they don't understand me. The economy is rigged for the rich and powerful. And those are global views. And then finally is social cohesion. Yes, we're polarized, or yes, we're moving into polarized and it looks east-west, but we've lost ground in our communities. It's about 53% now, but it's only who say they share the same values, but that's only because we're fighting COVID. It was down as low as 37% a year ago. I suspect it's on its way down there. And it's not just regional. I've been in focus groups where people in Mississauga said those people in Oshawa should have known better than to rely on the auto industry, and they're on their own. Like that kind of sentiment starting to bubble. And I think as we see winners and losers coming out of the COVID recovery, we'll see more splintering along pensioners versus non-pensioners, along age, along region, along public sector versus non-public sector, those kind of things. Whether they develop into full-blown polarized debates or not, or just make it much more difficult to find that shared narrative is the jury's still out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mike, for that. 60-second update. Okay, Don, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Lydia and Mike. So I guess I wanted to take a step back here for those of you who, some of you have been through all these sessions and some perhaps only this one. I wanted to take a step back and kind of look at the concept of what it is we think we're doing. We've talked about in these sessions about narrative and narrative building, and I want to take just a bit of an overview of what these things really mean and what we're trying to get out of these different discussions. So let me just start by talking a tiny bit about narrative. Think about this. If I were to give you a bunch of facts and data, very helpfully, Mike just did that, you will walk away from this, and what we know is facts and data are really hard to remember. But think about stories. If somebody tells you a story, a good story, lots of times you hear it once, you remember it for the rest of your life, or at least for a long time. Narrative is a really basic human skill. And stories are different from facts and data in that they contain information, facts and data, but they actually blend them with a range of other human experiences, values, emotions, mood, feelings. All of these things come together in a story in a remarkable way. And what a story does is it creates a lens through which we view a situation. A lens is perhaps the best metaphor I can use for the moment, but it creates a perspective on an issue. And from the point of view of, I'd say, of debate, this is a really powerful device. As I said, it creates a position. Think about the pandemic. When this thing first started, a lot of people were talking about the pandemic as a war. There's a metaphor, and that metaphor quickly builds a story. We say, wow, if the pandemic is a war with an unseen enemy, the stakes are really high. Then we start thinking, gee, we must have courage and make sacrifices in this context. We keep unfolding the story. We need to do our duty. How about we must follow orders? Think about that for a second in the context of that story. All of these things are elements that are unpacking in the story. If we must follow orders, do we have to wear masks? Should we or shouldn't we? We may begin to disagree on that. We may have different stories. So what I want to say here is an effective political narrative resonates with people because it provides in some way its own evidence. If you've read the paper that we did for this session, think about Michelle Rempel's example on the asylum seekers. She calls them cheaters and queue jumpers. And I'm not here to judge that, but what I do want to suggest to you is what she's doing in this case is she's unpacking very quickly a story that highlights specific features of that issue and packages it in a way that essentially explains a lot to the people it resonates with. It articulates their feelings. The problem with this is that we have competing narratives, right? People focus in on different features of an issue like that. So other people are saying asylum seekers are people in danger and distress. They're focusing on some other aspect of this. And I want to say, along with Lydia, there's nothing wrong with differences. There's nothing wrong with having differences and disagreeing about them. The question is one of degree, is when these things start to become self-justifying, they explain themselves because they speak so well to our experience, we stop listening to each other, or we can stop listening to each other. And indeed, in a lot of cases, that's what happens with narrative. We start speaking to those who are listening, and the narratives go off in different directions. So the key idea in these sessions is when we get too far apart, and I think in some cases we really are, do we have the skills for rebuilding a shared narrative, something that brings us back together? And our political debate, I would argue, in lots of cases is not very effective at that. We tend not to do a lot of it. So all I really want to say about a shared narrative is it is an effort, we'll talk more about this in the session, to go back to the basics and realize that lots of the distinct narratives out there are part of a whole. Can we stand back and begin to have a discussion where we find the connecting points and essentially create common ground so that we can engage each other meaningfully? That doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. A narrative is not something that solves all the problems. A good story usually has conflicts and tensions in it. What it does is it creates the context in which all of that makes sense so we can begin to understand what it is we disagree about and why we disagree, and begin to have a conversation that's informed and thoughtful and respectful and understanding about our differences. So in a nutshell, what we're really looking at here is trying to find ways to reconnect narratives when they get too far apart and begin to tell a story that brings people back together. We don't need this everywhere. We need this in certain cases. So I'll stop there and we'll get a chance, I think, to explore this more in the questions and answers.
This is what's awkward about Teams. You have to unmute and mute yourself. I think I'll just keep myself on so that we can have a conversation now with the three of us. I think that the both of you raised some really interesting positions, and I think I want to start with Mike, because you start by talking about how the media landscape has changed, and I think what you're saying is not only do we have more channels, people just sort of bringing up new media organizations, but social media has made stars out of certain individuals, right? If you have, and I think I want to focus a bit on Twitter, right? So Twitter allows people who are anonymous to post nasty statements and get millions of followers and become this thing. But it also creates what we call echo chambers. And so I'm curious, I think from both of you, is how do we have a dialogue if people are only going to very much narrow casting in their conversations and they're just reinforcing each other? I don't see this kind of healthy debate happening on on Twitter or social media. I just find it a nasty, horrible place that people have confirmation bias.
I can start. I think you're right. So the answer is I don't know, because I actually think that Twitter and social media is the place where you go to yell over the baffles at people who disagree with. It is not a place where anyone goes to pull together and find a concerted middle ground. It is not a place where even politicians go or political parties go to encourage people to come and join their parties. It's where they go to mobilize their base. It's where they go to take those who are, for lack of a better description, rabid supporters, and get them to go to protests and get them to move into public fora and do other things. It's not really a place. If you ever look at a political conversation and a scattergram of it, it's like a two pom-poms with a very thin string in between. Very few people cross over between the two issues. There are some, and there are issues where you can. If you are going to do it, and Don talks about it, is finding that middle ground and taking the debate away from the polarized specific issue and working it back to the values that we agree on. So if it's immigration, we agree on a strong economy. We agreed on a handful of things that you can tie it to, as opposed to discussing the flare-up points that come up too often, I think.
All right, John, do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I'd like to, actually, because I find this in some ways incredibly ironic. Those of us, I speak for myself now, I'm old enough to remember this. Before social media came around, and I was writing a lot on the emergence of information technology and its impact on democracy. And at that time, and I blush to admit I was one of those, there were some of us out there, lots of us, arguing that the technology was inherently democratizing. That was kind of what everybody seemed to think. We thought it was going to ensure that there'd be greater equality, greater involvement in debate, and so on. And ironically, 20 years later, we're looking back and saying it's done exactly the reverse. I'm not sure what to say about that, but let me just say this, is that when it comes to these things now being echo chambers, I think there is a question of what's the chicken and what's the egg, and I don't have the answer to that. But to go back to the thing about narrative, is that creating these sharp narratives, these very constrained narratives, partial narratives that resonate with people's experience and their values is certainly one way of reinforcing that. The echo chamber creates a space in which you can share your narrative that you share with others, and somebody else can have their other narrative in another echo chamber. Now, I don't know whether that our ability to create those narratives reinforced and created the echo chambers or the other way around. It's probably a little of both. But I guess my question is, what does it take to get back out of there? Is it just the technology? Could we use that technology to build shared narratives in a different environment with different kinds of processes? I'm actually relatively optimistic that we can. I will never go back to the view that the democracy or that the technology is inherently democratizing, but that it's inherently divisive. I don't think it's probably any more true. It just turns out that we're probably using that side of it. And I'd look for ways to do it differently.
Yeah, I mean, when you say, we thought technology was going to be really great for us and democratizing, it reminds me of, we all thought that if we just ate more at home and didn't go out to restaurants, we all would get thinner. And clearly the pandemic showed us how wrong that was too.
That's the little boy who's eating peanut butter cookies down the hall.
Yeah, for breakfast. Good choices. But Don, I guess I want to go back to you now and touch on something that you talked both in this segment and also in your opening remarks, and that is this idea that, I mean, you're making it sound like narrative is can be bad because it really focuses on one thing, but really that's what we call framing an idea, right? And politicians have been told to do this. I mean, I teach it in my own policy classes to my students. It's like, find a hook, find a way to simplify your argument so that it can be understood and captured. And essentially, we are information misers, right? We don't like to think too hard about things. You aptly point out the stats sort of go over our heads, but the story is what retains. So good communicators tell a story. So on the one hand, we can acknowledge that, but on the other hand, you're saying that's a problem. And I'm not sure how I could reconcile that as sort of somebody who does political communication. Don't I want to tell a story to get people to follow my ideas?
Absolutely. I'm not against stories at all. And I'm not even against the idea that people will organize in groups around stories. I would be just looking at this as a question of degree again, is when we find ourselves in, especially on political issues, at a point where the community, the sort of master narratives that keep us together that you referred to in the beginning of this session, when those master narratives start to break down, we probably have to look down and find out what's going on inside those master narratives with the other differences. People can have differences, of course they can in a democracy, and they can tell stories about them and they can organize around those. It's when those differences create a level of conflict or disagreement that the master narrative no longer works or is beginning to break down, that we have to have a serious look at what's going wrong. And I'm not saying that this is true of everything. I just think there are places where our master narrative, including things like the rule of law, are in question. I'll just close by saying this, go back to the Western alienation narrative, which I think has lots of legitimacy. There are lots of people out there, Lydia, as you will know, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, who think the rule of law is really not working very well for them, and that in fact, at some level, we're getting away from what a fair democracy really ought to be. And that's a problem. So that's where we have to ask ourselves, what's wrong with the story? Why is it working for some people and not others?
I guess, and just to add that, I would sort of ask you, I mean, that's sort of the challenge of this session, is how do you get people to listen to other people's narratives? You know, so for Westerners, the sort of the anti-Confederation, we got a raw deal story resonates with them. But how do you get people in Eastern Canada to even hear that? Because when I go on Twitter, which is not that often, people go, "Oh, you whining Albertans," right? They totally they don't even want to hear the story. They just say, "You guys are a bunch of whiners." So I'll let Don ask first, and then we'll go to Mike for a response.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lydia. And first of all, let me say that we didn't get into this problem overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight. There is no silver bullet here. There are better and worse ways of doing things and rebuilding trust and rebuilding confidence and rebuilding a conversation. I'd actually defer to Mike here. I just say that strategically, if you like, the kind of thing I would do, I wouldn't try to solve the whole problem at once. I would find areas where we can begin to rebuild trust by having an informed dialogue. And Mike, I hope will back me up on this. Maybe he'll contradict me. But one of the things that I find that's really interesting on some key issues is if you look at the polling, the narrative that's out there between the sort of speaking parties is relatively polarized, or even, as Mike says, splintered. Yet, in fact, the polling shows us that a lot of Canadians are somewhere in the middle. They don't necessarily buy into those extremes. What's going on is that the people who are articulating the issues for us are articulating it from the point of view of those extreme narratives, and the people in the middle don't have a story. So why wouldn't we create a process where they have a chance to articulate the middle ground in some way that speaks to their intuitions and their feelings about what's appropriate? And that might start to bring us back together a little bit. I'm not naive about the size and scope of this problem.
Yeah, I do agree with you, Don. I think one of the issues is first everybody looks for a hook and that's normal. Short, simple narratives are in today's world much easier that fit within context, that appeal to people both from a fact-based and emotional base. The flip side of that is those who disagree are very quick to demonize the differences and to paint you into a corner. And you can look at any number of issues, right? Look at the the CMHC looking at potentially, depending on whose side you're on, looking at taxing capital gains on homes, right? Probably a wise thing to think about given where we are from an economic standpoint, but immediately demonized as a liberal policy coming after people's money. And so right away it's starting off on a bad foot. So it's not even a policy consideration. You're right. Absolutely. There is a ton of middle ground on most of these issues. Whenever we ask a question, it's strongly agree to strongly disagree. More people fall in the somewhat agree, somewhat disagree category almost always, right? And I think part of the disconnect that people feel when they say governments don't care about me is people do want to find a middle ground. People do want to find consensus. People don't like arguments. People don't like to disagree. So when they hear the arguing on social media or when they hear the polarized debate, they're assuming you're not representative. Now, the flip side of that is it is much easier to mobilize your base and mobilize those who are going to get out vote. And at first past the poll, or even in the US where there's, a majority can win, it's a lot easier to get your 40% moving than it is to make your 10th 60%. Or get your 35% out and hope that the other folks don't show up to the polls. So we fight for the margins in politics, and that's the driving force of a lot of this.
Okay, I mean, I agree with you, but how do you, I'm going to go to Mike on this, how do you frame a middle ground narrative? Because it's actually quite boring, isn't it? Like that mushy middle. It's the reason why it's mushy is because it's boring.
It's family. It's family. It's family. It's opportunities for progress. It's safety, security, protection. It's, I hate to say it, but motherhood, fatherhood. It's like that, those core things, right? And as long as people have those, and we're pretty spoiled in Canada for the most part, most of us have those kind of things. The polls thrive to a certain extent, and you might find, we'll see, out of COVID, as the inequalities come out of, the inequalities are sharper and more clear. That more people, and I think you're seeing it, more people are raising the issue around Black Lives Matter. I mean, that's, part and parcel with COVID. Some of those inequalities that were papered over by a strong short-term domestic economy and couldn't get traction are now getting traction. So maybe those differences, those debate, and to your point up front about the protests, those protests will move us forward. If you go back and you look at whether it's the Depression or the Spanish flu or even SARS, a lot of good public policy came out of those things directly related to the task that people had to challenge. I have my doubts whether climate change gets a lot of traction in the next couple of years, but I do think some of the inequalities between population groups could get a lot of focus from governments because it's very sharp and people want it.
True, but it could also be the other side where people are already poised to be like, oh yeah, they're going to give us all this free money during the pandemic, but we're going to pay for it later. And so when you talk about the capital gains proposal on properties, people are going to be rightly objecting. But again, that's the two polarized sides, right? You have the property owners who say we don't want to be taxed more, and you have Indigenous people, Black Lives Matter, saying that they're just not getting a fair deal. But again, I see those as polarized sides. I'm trying to figure out where would the middle narrative come out there, and I guess either way we can answer that. Don, I guess.
Yes, I'd like to, and I'm going to take issue with the fact that the middle ground is mushy and boring, although it can be. Like, I think it's mushy and boring when we describe it and stop with things like, oh, you got to find a balance. Let's find the middle ground. Oh, everybody has a story to tell. You start there. I think those are cliches that are true, but I think finding the middle ground is actually difficult, challenging, and rewarding when you do, because it requires our deeper human skills about deliberation, dialogue, reflection, respect, and compromise, and finding something that works. It's solving a problem. I would argue what's boring and what is playing to people's simplest instincts and telling them that's an answer, which is a simple answer to the complex problem. So that we take, with all due respect to Michelle Rempel, we look at the problem of the asylum seekers and say they're all cheaters. At some level, I'm not saying that's not true. There's an issue there, but they're not just cheaters. just like they're not all beautiful people who are all in danger just trying to save their kids and their lives. It's a complicated situation. What I want to argue is the reason we steer away from the middle ground is precisely because it requires some serious effort, and our processes are not designed for that. Increasingly, our processes are designed to give us simplistic, colorful answers that play to emotions we already have, and that's boring and mushy. What I want people to do is sit down and actually say, listen to the person on the other side of the room, listen to their story, and ask yourself, how is that different from yours? Where does it actually connect or not connect? Can we find some ground? And the idea of making compromises is something we learned to do around the campfires back in the caves 10,000 years ago. It's a very fundamental human skill that allows us to live together. If we can't exercise that skill, we're flawed human beings. We need it to work together successfully in a society. What I want people to do is start using that skill at the political level again more effectively, rather than simply telling stories that play to people's emotions.
Don? Sorry, not Don. No, Mike.
I'll go again if you like.
No, I'm going to say something. I'm going to let Mike.
No, I agree. And you talked about the process, Don, and Parliament, political process. I think one of the things that has to change is we're rooted. You mentioned in your note, policy programming was rooted in communities, and our definition of communities has changed. We no longer have just communities of proximity. We also have communities of affinity. So I would argue Black Lives Matter is a community of affinity. Those people aren't necessarily connected by where they live. They're connected by how they feel, how they think about the world, and that's doesn't show up anywhere in our political processes, right? And those communities can be young people. There's a great picture that I show in a lot of my presentations of the Canadian junior hockey team moments after they did, they're all 19-year-old men, moments after they've won the gold and their biggest accomplishment ever. They're in the change room. They haven't taken off their equipment yet. They're all on their phones. They are not celebrating together. This is a community of proximity. They're not even with the people they've been working with. They're on their phones talking to parents and girlfriends and family members, right? Or whomever, right? They're texting. One guy's on his phone. But it shows you that we no longer have the same anchors we used to. It used to be, I'm from Russell, Ontario, and my community is Russell, Ontario. Well, now I'm as likely to have friends in Texas and in France and in Thailand, and have a community of those people who I think share the same values with. So we don't organize ourselves, and I don't know how you do that from a parliament, how parliament pulls that in. But the notion that the MP is going to come back, canvass everybody who lives here now, and say this is what the people in Russell think, and get a concerted view, when people organize their communities differently is very difficult now.
And I guess that leads to my sort of question for both of you, is that who's doing the talking? Because when I watch the House of Commons, which I do often, there's no exchange of ideas. There's a question, and then there's a canned response, and then they repeat their canned response. I don't see debate happening, at least during question period. But I'm just trying to unpack this, sort of who's going to be doing the talking and where are they going to.
Sorry, Lily, you just locked out of me. I'm not sure if that's directed at me. I can't hear, so I'm going to assume that it is. And I guess my point here, at the risk of sounding sort of very repetitive, is that I think a question period is a splendid example of the packaging of sort of fragmented narratives, where they're not even talking to each other. They're speaking to their base, as you said, Mike, and basically they're organizing talking points around a simple narrative that speaks to a very select group of people, their market share, to use that horrible expression. And they're actually not interested in speaking to the people on the other side of the aisle, whichever side they're on, government or opposition. So I guess I would argue this, is if we want to try and build shared narratives again from the bottom up, the place to start is probably not Parliament. It's probably somewhere outside of Ottawa on the ground, where we try to bring people together, and that can be stakeholders too, but people who actually are the polling people that show up in your results, Mike, who say, what is the middle ground, or I'd like some, and let them start telling their stories a little bit to each other and see if they have those basic human skills of creating a bit more of a shared narrative. I've got lots of ideas on process that's a little more technical. Maybe we'll get there, but I think we do need the right kind of process and the right environment to do this, and Parliament right now is definitely not that place.
Yeah, I would agree. I'm not a process expert, but I do think that you have to, and I hate to use the term, but it almost needs to be grassroots. Whether that community is an affinity based community or a geographic based community, you need to almost twin those communities and say, start with your discussions. Don't fight about the small things. Start with the things that you can agree on. Start with your core values. And I bet when you line up most of those groups' core values, what they want, it's hard to argue that the others shouldn't have the same thing, and start to build up from there. The problem right now is politics is a short-term game. We do practice retail politics, and that is the focus, and it is about how can we get people out. We don't have long drawn-out debates anymore. We don't have, and that hurts us from a policy perspective because we're never going to, at least in the short run, sink the time in to have a discussion about the GST or to have a discussion about free trade. Those policy debates where we used to spend 2 years having it kick around the country to come to a conclusion about where we're going to go. Now it's how fast can we get this in and get it out and how do we minimize debate in order to get ourselves through. Majority governments are the omnibus bills and it's not this government. All governments have done us no favor and have made that institution for many communities just theater.
So Lydia has disappeared on us again, so I'm just going to take the opportunity, seize the opportunity, and take this a step further. So people out there may be wondering, geez, if Parliament is not the place to start, and these are lots of you folks out there are government folks, you'll be maybe saying, how the hell are we supposed to do this? How do we get this going? It may well be that Parliament is not the place to start, but that doesn't mean that governments governments of all stripes don't have a very big interest in trying to do some of these kind of dialogue processes that might build some shared ground. And let me tell you why. You will all know this as public servants, is if the minister is faced with a challenge where he or she has to make an important decision that requires fundamental trade-offs that are controversial, and there are stakeholders out there in the community on all sides, the minister is sitting there saying, no matter what I do, when I make a decision at cabinet or cabinet makes a decision and I take it back out to the community, there's not enough cohesion and agreement out there. I'm going to get hit from all sides, even if some people are on my side. In other words, I can't even get out of my own end zone with this issue. How am I supposed to solve it? The minister has an interest in creating or seeing created enough cohesion in the community that he or she can get out of their end zone and pick up the ball. So what these processes can do for the minister, for the government, and for indeed Canadians is build enough cohesion by getting enough agreement on some of the stuff. Not that it solves all the problems, but there's enough support and cohesion out there that the minister can actually pick up the ball, or the government can, and start moving ahead with some ideas and some discussion. But they're stuck in their own end zones on some of these issues. So what government ought to be doing is finding out where are some of these places where we're stuck in our end zone, but we have to make some decisions. And Mike, you can tell them that there are some people out there who actually do want middle ground, and a process could be launched where we could find and build some middle ground. And that's a win for the minister, and that's a win for Canadians because they start to come together. Those are the kind of opportunities we should be seeking out.
Yeah, interestingly, we used to do a lot of that work. We do very little of it over the last decade. There used to be a lot of work in helping governments communicate policy and move things forward, and finding that middle ground to help frame debates and bring sides together. And it's less and less of what we're called on to do. More worrisome, I think, longer term, more worrisome or not, is this decline in the efficacy of government and its ability to get things out of their own end zone has led people to say, I want to see a bigger private sector role in social and political issues. I want to know that the money I spend day in and day out can affect social change. And what you're seeing is corporations, for all the right reasons and for pure business reasons, not that those are wrong, start to run with it and start to get involved in issues like Black Lives Matter much more forcefully, and climate change and a whole range of things. And that's only because people have said, businesses are so big nowadays and they have such reach into communities. I want them to help my community. I want them to think about that. And so you have, a shift to human capitalism. You have a shift to stakeholder versus shareholder values. You have what BlackRock had said on climate change. If you don't have a climate change or a carbon reduction plan, and we're not investing in you, and you have what the Business Council in the U.S. has, their premise to go out and talk about shareholder value from communities through to employees through to suppliers. So that movement, I think, is in some ways a challenge to government to say, if you're not going to fix some of these things, people, and that's the middle ground, people are saying they want to. People literally said to me in focus groups, I vote once every 4 years, but I spend money every day, Mike. And if I walk 4 or 5 more blocks or 2 more blocks to get to that place, and we're seeing it online now, people pushing back against China and saying, I went to look for a fan and I looked all over the place until I found a fan that wasn't made in China. And then Canadians, individuals are going to start, all nations are going to start to do those kind of things because they realize they have a lever there. And so that may be a positive thing, and it may help government find its way back to a middle ground as people move that way.
I'm back. That was the bell.
Oh. Welcome back, Lydia.
I heard that, so that's good. I got most of what you guys were saying, and I guess it's this idea of where do people get their information, sort of back to Mike's opening comments, is that we're more splintered, or we're more fragmented. But at the same time, I mean, the pandemic did show we can get agreement on some things. I mean, if you look at, I guess it's your own polling, but if you look at people's ranking of all provincial governments and the federal government, they're doing really well. Like, people agree that the CERB, for example, I think there's a lot of consensus around the CERB. So how did that happen? How did, does it take a plague to get us to get along, or is there can we do this without having a global pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it really, for a lot of the politicians, particularly I'll focus on Canada, it was textbook. I mean, the open, transparent, reliance on science, a willingness to shift day in and day out as the science shift to be say, we didn't know everything a week ago, but we've learned more today. And it really was a plague that made us focus, and Canadians responded and said, yeah, okay, I agree with you, and I'm good with this, and I understand there are unknowns. And so that openness where and I would say the opposition parties as well didn't jump on early on anyway, the leaders, whether federally or provincially, and say, oh, you switched, you did this. There was no gotcha politics for about a month, which allowed us to get off to a good footing. We're seeing more splintering now. We're seeing more debate out of the CERB. So, even the CERB, people were pretty universal that it had to happen. But now those people who said, yes, it had to happen, are now going, but I think it might be abused. And I'm starting to worry about how we pay it down. And so that's where I think we start to see some splintering, and it may be short-lived.
Lydia has, I think, disappeared again, has she? Sadly. I'll pick up here. I guess I'd say this is that to go back to the crisis thing, Lydia, are you back? Oh, I think she just got knocked off again. So I guess I would say this is that to me, fairly simplistically, looking at the cooperation and collaboration that emerged around COVID, and by the way, back in the economic crisis in 2008, I think what that shows us is that, in fact, there is lots of common ground. And it's just not typically in the interest of politicians, as they understand the game, and the game is now played, to draw attention to middle ground. It's the reverse. It's actually to polarize and be as far apart and distinguish yourself for market share as you possibly can. So I'm not sure that I'm not surprised to see that as this moves on, we'll revert back very quickly to the kind of conventional politics that we've seen for a long time, and there will be very little willingness. So I think what people realize is, in the midst of a crisis, they do actually have to play the game properly, and that shows us the game can be played better. So what we really ought to be looking for, I think we should be looking for ways not to force our politicians to play the game differently, because they're not likely to. It's to reward them for playing the game differently. And that's where I think, like the example I gave before about finding wins for the minister. The minister doesn't just want to go out and consult so that people get to make decisions. And I don't think we should pitch that to the minister. What we should really be saying is, this is a problem that's not going to get solved, and it's going to be a problem for you and your government unless and until you actually create more cohesion in the environment, and we have ways of doing that. And I think there's an interesting question: could we do things like that for the opposition? Can we give them a win through these kind of processes? Is it in the government's interest to give the opposition a win, so that we're not going to solve the problem everywhere, but we find some common ground? I think one thing I just wanted to draw attention to earlier, if we think about the sort of the extent to which we have broken down and eroded trust with many Indigenous communities. I mean our governments and sort of the mainstream society. We hopefully won't throw up our hands in despair and say that can never be fixed now because trust is almost gone. But we don't think it's going to change overnight either. What we think we need to do, and what they keep telling us we need to do, is rebuild the relationship over time. And what that means is we have to look at places strategically where there's opportunities to build or rebuild trust and other things through the right kinds of processes and the right kinds of relationships. And we didn't get into this mess overnight. We're not going to get out of it overnight, but it doesn't mean we're stuck there forever. And I think we should learn an important lesson from it.
We don't, we collectively, anybody on either side, we don't reward incremental gains. You know, and you can look at, I won't pick specific examples, but in almost every situation, whether it's a business development loan or some changes in the way we work on treaties, small gains are almost universally met with "it's too little, too late" from the opposition, and I mean both the opposition. It could be political opposition or those in the communities, rather than yes, this is only 15% of where we think we need to go, but it is a right step in the right direction, and let's start to work on the next 10%, 20%. It's almost an all or nothing for many of these communities. And I'm not picking an Indigenous, but I mean those broader communities, whether it's Black Lives Matter, someone lobbying for economic development in rural Ontario, et cetera. It's you either get it all or you don't get, or you complain. And that's not, to your point about ministers wanting to get the ball out of their end zone. Why would you do something if you know, you're always going to be criticized for only being 2/3 complete? It's very, very difficult to sort of win. So what you do is you focus on absolute wins and only absolute wins.
So let me ask you, Mike. Let me become the moderator. Let me put a question to you. Looking at the kind of research you've been doing, are there opportunities out there, constructive opportunities to build a win-win, right? To where we could make some serious progress on those?
Yeah, I think there are, and I think there are some opportunities where we could, at the very beginning, shore up the value of government. There is a lot that government does very well that government has stopped communicating on because of the view that it's not, as Lydia said, it's not sexy. And it's not at the political level, right? And so we're not spending money on, it used to be advertising, but we're not spending money on communicating some of the things that people that have happened very well, some of the processes that are way below the political stream that happen. And you know it happens, Don, because you're in Ottawa and you talk to people, and I know it happens because I'm in Ottawa, and I'm sure it happens everywhere else. But we don't communicate small wins to add up to sort of momentum. The government achieves what it wants to do. So what do we hear about? And you know, the prime example of late is I was anyways in BC a long time ago, not that long ago, just before COVID, and someone said
that was a long time ago.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Better world.
Someone said to me, "How are things in Ontario?" And we were talking about efficacy of government. And at the time, you had the Phoenix pay system, you had the LRT in Ottawa, and you had the Ontario government's inability to produce license plates you could see at night. Three fairly basic public initiatives that were completely, pardon the pun on LRT, off the rails. And then you go, well, you know, so there's lots going on that's good, right? There's a lot of things happening on local health authorities that is good, that, you know, we have seen globally and in Canada, poverty numbers decline. We've seen better relations in communities. We've seen health numbers improve. Those things don't happen by accident. Those things are happening, but you get no credit for it because the LRT doesn't run, or you get no credit for it because there's 3 weeks of coverage on how you use the wrong paint in a license plate, and you don't push back. You know, governments seek to minimize their criticism rather than say, you know, and when they do it and they say, well, look what's happening good over here, the knee-jerk reaction from the media and from the opposition is, oh, you're doing it to deflect, because it's not done on a regular basis. So I think we have to start talking about the good things the government do and not look for short-term wins.
I see Brad out there.
By the way, I'm back. Sorry about that. I'm going to remind people that for those of you like myself who keep on getting kicked out because technology hates us, that this is being recorded, and you can find this on the IOG YouTube channel later on, so we can actually hear all the answers to all these questions, which I'm excited about. I guess I'm going back to the media question, Mike. So you're saying that the media tends to focus on the negative, but again, we have these echo chambers. We have all these different channels. You'd think that you know, the YouTubers out there and the organizations that have their own narrative would be like, you know, why is it nobody's thought of having a good news channel? You know, just say we're going to focus on the positive. It's almost like that old adage that even though we have these new mechanisms, we're still going back to if it leads, it leads, and we haven't gotten out of a traditional journalistic frame. So either of you, maybe you can touch on that.
That's a tough one. You would think that there should be a good news channel. I mean, I think USA Today, a long time ago when it first started to print a paper, tried to have that focus, right? That it wasn't all doom and gloom, that there was an upside to some of the world. But as a rule, the things that are media and the things that get traction tend to be, you know, the downfall of something or the gotcha piece. And I'm not blaming journalists. I think it's you know, they have far fewer resources. I remember talking to Craig Oliver a couple of years ago, and he said, you know, there used to be a day when you would go to a World Trade Summit and you would spend all day talking to people because you had to file at 6 p.m. And he goes, you know, now most of the journalists never get to the World Trade Summit. They're in a hotel nearby and they're tweeting and they're blogging and they're doing 7 hits over the course of the day based on the press releases they got. So you're close to it, but you're not really there. And just that's technology, and the world has changed and made their change. You know, you've asked them to do far more with far fewer resources, and the result is a thinner gruel, which, you know, probably leads to, you know, if we can find the more sensational, we do. Right,
Don?
I'd probably just echo some of what Mike has said. I mean, I remind people, if they haven't seen the story, that the Toronto Star was just sold for $48 million. $48 million. 10 years ago, it would have been sold for $2 billion, right? Yeah. The pounding that media organizations have taken in terms of their revenues, especially print media, like it's just, I think it's got them all reeling. If you're a journalist, it's a very hard time to be a journalist. I would also then put in on top of that the fact that the interest increasingly in news media, that is to say, political news, is very much driven, I think, by the sort of segregated marketplace in there, by all those divisions. And that means if you want to start up a new news organization, then you might start up something like Sun News, right, which didn't last. But you're going to pick something that plays to a base and a market share you think is out there, and you're going to play to it. So I think the situation just reinforces all of those assumptions that we have about media becoming fragmented, just like the echo chambers elsewhere. And we all know what's going on in the States. So I don't have a simple answer to that. I don't think there is one. I would say this is I think we really have to recognize, there's nothing inevitable about any of this, at least not in my mind. What it does mean is that in order to change it, I think it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and we need to look for points of leverage where we can start to make progress and make wins and build on the wins. I don't know how else to do it. There's no silver bullet here.
That's no fun. maybe I could go for a lightning round as we end our time together. So maybe I'll just do some fast questions and quick answers from you guys. So, Mike, where do people get their news? Like, what if there is an average viewer or reader? Where are they getting information?
Oh, everywhere. That's the problem. As Don noted, it's a lot of it's peer generated. The thing we value the most is something sent to us from somebody we know. So it could be a Bloomberg story that I send to you. Could be a peer created TikTok video that my kid sends to another kid. Those are the things that we value the most. Those are the things that we anchor and trust the most. Everything else we have a big question mark on.
So, John, where could we have our conversations to be more civil and find middle ground?
Where could we?
Yeah.
I would say this is, to repeat, but I think as Bear's repeating, I think we can turn to people like Mike and say, where is there an opportunity? And I think we need to do two things here. One is find out that there's a space where the public actually wants to articulate middle ground because nobody's doing it for them, so they're ready for something. And secondly, I think you've got to make this a win for at least the government, if not the opposition, and maybe both. So I think we can be strategic about this. If I could go very quickly, I don't know if this could be done. I was going to ask Mike, but in the last couple of sessions, we've talked about the tensions between climate and economy, particularly in Alberta. And 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the idea of a shared narrative between those on the climate side and those on the industry side was simply not going to happen. But something that has happened in the last 10 years is much of industry is coming around to the view that if we want to survive, we're going to have to adapt. Climate change is real, and we're going to have to go to a sustainable economy. So they're now accepting the premise that change is necessary. And what that means is in the narrative, the difference is now actually quite focused. The difference isn't on the fundamentals. The narrative is kind of shaping up and making common ground. The real question is the transition. How fast and how far and who does it and how is it done? Mm-hmm. I don't think citizens should solve that problem, but I think they could be brought into a discussion around transition that helps to sort of put some parameters around what an acceptable solution might look like that might create space for governments to have a conversation with industry and others.
Yeah, I agree. I think that something could have been done in that space, but we immediately jumped to a wedge policy in the carbon tax. We immediately picked something that drove divisions between people, between those who can afford and those who can't, between a whole range of groups, and that became the focus. So the focus in Canada has been carbon tax or no carbon tax, not can we find numerous other ways to have a sustainable economy. And I think had we started with a broader approach, spent a little more time and not tried to focus on the quick policy win or the quick retail political win, we would have had a very different debate, and we might have a base right now, Don, where we're moving forward incrementally slower, but making progress as opposed to now, prior to of late, was largely stalled, with everybody saying, I think it's a good idea, but I don't want to pay for it.
Right. And I guess we don't want to get into climate debate right now because we could be here for the rest of the time, because, the oil sands is a great case study. I mean, one way to deal with climate is to, instead of transporting oil across in tankers or in trains, you put it in pipes. But that created its own polarizing issue. You think, yep. Okay, we can actually have a lower emission with what is arguably a high emission product, but at least if we have it underground in pipes, we're mitigating some of that issues. Anyway, we have some questions from our viewers out there, so I'm gonna let them have their chance here. So from Natalie Frank, she says, it is a good point about not communicating small wins. At the same time, if we publicize that roundtables are making progress and coming to a shared understanding of a problem, that is very frustrating for citizens and can further alienate them from the political process. Any suggestions on how to address this? I'll let whoever wants to start.
I would take a crack at that. This is a longer discussion, but something we've been looking at and are experimenting with, in particular with a project we're doing around the development of the new hospital in Ottawa. You can have a layered process. That is to say, you can have a relatively small group of people, say 20 or 25, or a series of roundtables, where you have a very focused and sort of thoughtful discussion of the issues. And this is where narrative comes in. A lot of that will be technical and so on, depending on the discussion. But if it's focused and if it's going on for some time, you may be really getting into the issues. People are learning. They're looking at various aspects, science, other things. But what you can do is you can use that to sort of say, what's the narrative around this, and have a second level of the process, which is much more broader and narrative oriented, and which brings the public in on a larger level, perhaps online or other ways, so that they are telling the larger story. They're participating in that bigger question around the story that shapes our thinking inside. It's like setting broad parameters. And that gives the public, could give the public, I would argue, a meaningful voice, not in the detail, but helping to make sure that that conversation at the center is reflecting what the public at large wants to say. And it gives the public a sense of ownership and participation in that decision, and gives the decision some legitimacy. So you can stack or layer the process. It's difficult, but I think this can be done. And I would argue it could be done on a large scale.
Mike?
I agree, and I think, you know, we've done it. Part of it is, and I think Don's saying, is you have to frame the discussion, and you have to lay out the groundwork very clearly for people. So we did some work on medically assisted dying, and brought very polarized groups to the table to sit and talk to each other. But we very clearly said, we're not making a decision today. This is about you telling your side, and it's about having a story. I'm not looking for you to convince those people opposite you, and I'm not looking for them to be convinced by you. And you laid out the groundworks, and people were quite respectful in sitting across from each other and saying, here's why I oppose it. And others were saying, and here's why I'm for it. And we left it there, and we didn't try to achieve anything else there at the initial phase, other than to get it on the table, so that as you start to go through and you start to formulate policy, you know where, you know, purely from a communication standpoint, you know where your fault lines are, you know where your opportunities are, you know where you overlap, and there's even a little bit of consensus that you can say, you know, we do know that both groups want this, but we've decided to go opposite directions, you know, so it is possible. But too often, you know, we make these, and it happens a lot at the municipal level, we make these dialogue sessions, dog and pony shows, where we expect people to come in and hear what we've already decided, and basically accept that as a fact, and people don't like that, and people will push back against it. And so it really needs to be framed well, and be early enough in the process that people don't feel like the policy or the decision's already been baked.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it's the challenge of getting people to tell their stories, and also to have other people actually listen and hear them. Mm-hmm. And that's the real crux of it. So from the IOG team, they're asking, thinking back to the comments about the need to change political culture to one of greater collaboration amongst parties, are there countries that model this well? I'll let Mike start.
Are there countries that model this well? Not top of my head. I can't think of any that do it. I mean, we talked about Brexit at the very beginning, right? And that's a classic example of, you know, a complete polarized debate and discussion. And it's now that things are happening. I was just talking to someone from the UK the other day that Amazon has pulled down its EU approved products, and suddenly there's a bit of a wave going, what? I didn't know, as one of my colleagues said, who knew that the face eating party was going to actually eat our faces? That we were told this, but people just voted for it anyway. And now, you know, the Amazon product line has gotten shorter in the UK because they're not approved. They're EU products that just can't come into the UK. And so people are going, well, I didn't vote for this. They're like, yes, you did, right? So I don't know that it works well. I mean, any Western democracies tend to have that confrontational push between parties that it certainly doesn't work in the U.S.
Right. Don?
Yeah, I guess I would say this. First of all, I'm very active with the Open Government Partnership, which has 79 countries and its members. And we just completed a study with them on deliberation. And I can tell you, as a matter of fact, it's not well used anywhere. But this shouldn't surprise us. I think we have to see this as a historic development, is we are in a period where I think we're struggling with certain kinds of problems that are relatively new. In some sense, they were always there, but they're new for the political world. And I would just say a very simple sketch of this is to say that the more interdependent the world becomes and the more interdependent issues become, we used to keep them fairly siloed, right? And it wasn't that hard to strike a balance between competing values because inside the silos, the values were relatively clear. The value conflict started really surfacing when we started crossing silos and said, well, if you want sustainable development, you've got to match the economy with the environment. And that suddenly brought very different values into conflict with one another. And this is now happening all over the place. And the cabinet system is not meant to manage that kind of conflict. So I think what is happening is we're trying to figure out, back to the end zone metaphor, when governments are dealing with this kind of deep conflict in values at the cabinet table, how do we get them to out of the end zone and far enough down the field they can make some progress? And I think what we're experimenting with here are new ways of dealing with old problems about trade-offs, but now the trade-offs are much bigger, and we need more robust processes that give the public a role in helping to strike those balances in a way that legitimizes the decisions. So it's not a surprise that no government's there. I think everybody's facing the same problem, and we're just learning how to try and actually contend with it.
Okay, thanks. Carolyn asks, what's the relationship between a shared narrative and economic stability and well-being? As we head into difficult economic times, are narratives more likely to become divisive, and is part of the answer to focus on strong economic recovery?
I can hop in. I mean, it's funny because so we for most Canadians, we hit tough economic times in the last quarter of 2018. The macroeconomic numbers look great. We were at a record low unemployment. Banks were making profits. The governments were not flush with cash, but doing pretty well. But Canadians dipped below a level. We have a disruption problem, but dipped below the norms for the first time in about 8 quarters. And when you talk to them, they said, I'm struggling to make ends meet. The affordability is a key issue for me. What I hear and see around the big picture does not match what's happening at my kitchen table. Yes, there are lots of jobs. They're bad jobs. Yes, there are lots of jobs, but they have no social support. They have no retirement pensions. They have nothing there. Really what it was is 2018 was the final straw for 2008-2010 non-recovery. When Mr. Trudeau was elected in 2015, people sort of said, okay, it's going to happen now. And like the very high expectations that the economy was going to recover at the local level. It never did. So we went into COVID at one of the lowest ever levels of economic resiliency at the personal level. COVID has piled on top of that. We've actually seen people lift back up considerably in the last couple of months, back to where they were pre-COVID, not back to a positive sentiment. So yeah, I mentioned early on that, context matters. And right now the context for most people is, can I get back to 2018? Things weren't great, but they were a lot better than they are today. And so when you add on grand expectations of a rejuvenized cities agenda, climate change, some of those things, people are like, whoa, that's too much. So I think you need to start with how we can get you back to whole for a good chunk of the population, or how we can fix some of the inequities that we've seen developed as a result of COVID before you can move on to the next piece, or you start to do them side by each. It's probably a better way to do it.
Don?
Yeah, I mean, I think I give a fairly straightforward answer to this, which probably echoes some of the things that Mike has said. Is there a connection between shared narrative and economic prosperity or development or stability? And the short answer is absolutely. At least that doesn't mean we should be running around all over the place trying to create shared narratives. It means in places where we need a shared narrative because there's high levels of conflict and tension, what a shared narrative does is create cohesion. And cohesion gives us an opportunity to actually focus on solving problems and making progress rather than struggling with one another. So all I would say is if we created greater cohesion in areas where there's tension, that's probably good for economic development. And shared narrative is a fundamental way of creating cohesion.
I will add one thing that on that. And as much as I said communities are changing, it's still that shared narrative has to get down to the community level. We can't say there's some great macroeconomic numbers across the country, because I can tell you in St. Thomas, where I'm from originally, versus Toronto, there's a very different economic narrative. So when people hear about great things happening, web development jobs, the tech sector booming, largely people in St. Thomas are going, it's not happening here, so it's not relevant to me. Right now, 2/3 of Canadians expect in the next 10 years that their quality of life or their financial position is at best the same, probably worse. So you think about trying to convince people to look forward, save for retirement, invest in children's education. 2/3 say same or worse. The very first time I raised these numbers, I was actually on Bay Street, and everybody went, well, that's not the case. It's not on Bay Street. And I asked people in the room, how many people feel that? And nobody put up their hand. I said, so how far do we have to go down the road? Peterborough, Lanark County, I'm using Ontario, but Southern Ontario, before 8 and 10 sit in a room, or 9 and 10 sit in a room and say, status quo would be a fantastic thing for me 10 years from now. So you think about progress, optimism, things you want for your family. We're the first generation who thinks the next generation is going to have a harder time having a house, have a harder time with healthcare, have a harder time retirement. So what's my incentive to invest if I think things are going to get worse rather than better? And I invest, I mean, in my whether my portfolio, my time, my job, my effort, a whole range of things. So that's the economic narrative that's out there right now.
Yeah, no, well, certainly Ontario, there are different pockets of the province, and so you can't use the Ontario data to speak to any region. I mean, I'm here in Southwestern Ontario. A lot of things sort of passed us by, and there's still lots of the challenges ahead. We have time for one more question, and this one's from Michelle Bailey. She asked, the government used the Team Canada narrative through the crisis, recognizing opposition parties and provincial governments in the efforts to manage the pandemic. This narrative seems to be weakening a bit as the immediate crisis subsides, but it isn't possible to reinvigorate this shared narrative as we move to recovery. I'll let Don start this one.
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a nice example. I mean, when you were knocked off, Lydia, I think Mike and I had a little exchange about the extent to which the crisis motivates the government to, not only the government and opposition and other governments to work together. And what that tells us is actually there are lots of points of convergence out there, or they wouldn't be able to. It's just they need a crisis to get them there. And the Team Canada, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but it's the right idea. It's the idea that we all have a shared interest in this, and then working together as a team rather than having somebody tell everybody else what to do and everybody trying to pull their part out it's the collaboration narrative, right? I don't think this is the right narrative everywhere, and I don't think it's going to work on everything, but I would certainly think there are places where we could build on that narrative and drive it down to a particular context and a particular set of issues where it would get purchased and it would be valuable. In fact, I guess I want to have a little difference of opinion with you here, Lydia. It's not that when you said at the beginning, I think lots of times that very good things do come out of disagreement. I'm not opposed to disagreement at all. I would just sort of say it's not just disagreement. Like, good things come out of collaboration, right? Lots of times people do good things when they like each other and they're working well together. That's what a team does. So there's nothing wrong with, sometimes tensions are good. They can be creative and constructive. And sometimes collaboration and agreement is good. There's lots to be said about when. All I would say is it's not one or the other. It's a lot of it is context dependent, and both can be valuable and constructive.
Mike?
I think so. I think the challenge in the Team Canada narrative in the absence of a crisis is, to Don's point, is finding the things that you use it for. And they almost need to be things that are below the political sphere, that you say to parties, this is one of those things that we both lose if it doesn't go well. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it, right? So let's just work together on this. And let's not necessarily make it a big focus on how we're doing collaborative efforts, because it doesn't play well to our base. Let's just make sure that we do it. And we will reinforce the value of government, because we will achieve better things without saying we're going to do it, right? I mean, so it's that notion of let the results speak for themselves. But that's very hard to do, to sit down with politicians and say, do this, it's really good, but don't talk about it. But that is sort of what you need to do on some of the things that, we'll have our differences and we'll fight our battles over those things in the electorate. But on X or Y, let's not make a big deal about it. Let's just move ahead and let's take this off of the political radar screen.
Yeah, it's been an interesting process watching the differences, the lack of differences of opinions between the provinces and the federal government. I mean, I remember last summer, the big conference between the premiers and the feds was really contentious, lots of demands, lots of rhetoric, and it's bizarre for me to see, and I still can't get used to it. Doug Ford praising Justin Trudeau and the federal government and saying, how Chrystia Freeland is his good friend. It's like, oh, okay, this is something strange. Something strange has happened in the world. All right, well, thank you both for answering those questions, and thank you to our participants for asking them. So we are at near the end, not quite there, but near the end of this process. And now my discussants have 2 minutes each for closing comments. And I want to thank everybody for their patience with me hopping on and off with my technical glitches. So I'll let Don have the last word. How's that?
Thanks, Lydia. I actually want to pick up on something Mike was saying a few minutes ago about sort of the community needing to buy in or have ownership of these narratives and so on. It's interesting. We're here talking about narrative, and narrative is hardly a new word in anybody's lexicon in almost every area. And politicians have been sort of kicking around the talk about narratives for at least 25 or 30 years. So somebody might sort of say, wow, this is a little bit old, isn't it? But here's the difference. I think a really important thing is that the use of narrative in politics and some other areas is largely been from the top down. That is to say, it's seen as a communications tool for messaging, right? We create a story that simplifies an issue, that plays to some part of our base, that packages it in the way that I had talked about before. So you're not looking necessarily to, you're essentially trying to communicate with a more effective tool. What I want to say here is it surprises me. This is what got me onto narrative, is thinking how rarely we think of narratives being created from the bottom up. I mean, in the political context, they almost never are. Maybe in the past when we did policy processes differently 50 or 100 years ago, I don't know. But it does seem to me the difference is this, is that if you really want, buy-in is something you get when you do it from the top. And what buy-in is, it's when you tell a story and you ask people to give you permission to do something. So you tell them the right story and you get buy-in, means they sort of say, yeah, okay, that's all right with me. Increasingly, I would argue that to make the sort of decisions that we need and to find the solutions we do, you not only need buy-in from people, you need some deeper level of commitment and sometimes even action. You need to mobilize them around the climate or healthcare or whatever it may be and get them to change their behavior. And you don't get them to change their behavior by pitching a story to them that they buy into, because buy-in is about giving permission. You change their behavior by getting them to create a story together that they internalize and that they actually have some ownership of and see as a way of articulating their own values. So this is really about a break with the way we talk about narrative. We're talking about shared narratives from the bottom up. We're talking about building them in a way that gives people an invested sense of ownership, an internalization of the narrative, and that actually motivates them to do things differently.
Thank you, Don. Mike?
My view is we can't look back. I am of the age where I will read a policy paper, and I will listen to an album from the first song to the last song as it was meant to be played in the 1970s and 1880s. But that's not today's world. Today we stream music, we stream videos, we have 280 character policy announcements and media releases. We have 30-second TikTok videos. The days when you could go off as a band, cut an album in a old house somewhere or whatever, disappear for 3 years, come back, dump it, and expect that a combination of, at its worst, payola, at its best, radio play, would carry it forward and create your career, and you could just do that because you were just so good at it, are gone. And it's the same thing. You can't develop policy in the back rooms of government and come out and drop it in front of the population. Just like music, you need to interact with the fans, interact with the citizens. You need to take pieces of it out and test run it and say, do you like this? Do you like that? And you need to build it in small, bite-sized, digestible pieces that lead to a career or that lead to a following. Because I think if you go down, the old school, it just falls on deaf ears. If someone were to launch a 30-page policy paper today, very, very few people outside of my generation who have a political background or the public policy background would read it. You want to reach into I have a 25-year-old, it's got to be something that shows up quick and probably in video. So
yes, and snappy and tight and a little bit nasty. It's a fascinating world we're living in. Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Mike College, Don Lenahan, for participating in this interesting debate. I think it's given a lot of us food for thought. It's been my pleasure being part of it, even though I've had my own technical difficulties. It was a lot of fun. Got my adrenaline going, and this is actually the most fun I've had in 3 months. So thank you to the IOG for inviting me and for putting this together. I see Brad is back, so I'm going to let him close on behalf of the Institute. And thank you both again.
Thanks, Lydia. Thanks, Mike.
Great, thank you,
Thanks,
Lydia.
both.
Maybe it's because your internet connection's still stuck in phase 2 in Windsor, but yeah, really like to thank you for moderating such a great discussion. Mike and Don, always interesting and insightful, and it's another chapter for the dialogue and debate series. And I would like to thank everyone who viewed and participated and asked good questions during this session. And I would also like to thank our sponsors. Now, a reminder, our final learning session in this series will begin at 9:30 sharp tomorrow morning, where Rhonda and Dawn will be facilitating as we delve into the process of creating a shared narrative using a rules-based approach for building trust. And also a further reminder that the IOG will be authoring a paper that explores the themes of this project, the issues and topics we examined, as well as the solutions to building narratives. And that paper will be released in the fall via the IOG website. Again, thanks all for participating, and for most of you, we'll chat in the morning. Have a great day.